FNL Newshour moves to Scotland, to Ayrshire, to Dumfries House. Dumfries House is an 18th century Palladian residence with associated grounds covering 2,000 acres. Now our guest today is Sir Malcolm Rifkind, the Right Honourable Sir Malcolm Rifkind. He's also a Queen's Counsel. He has been Secretary of State for Scotland, Secretary of State for Transport, Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretary. And subsequently, following 18 years of ministerial office, he became Chairman of the Intelligence Security Committee in the House of Commons. So, Sir Malcolm, welcome
Thank you very much.
To Dumfries House and to the FNL Newshour. I think last night was quite interesting. I was watching News 24 in France, the French news channel, my favourite one, and the cyber problems which hit this weekend and hit the UK NHS now impact on 75,000 organisations and 100 countries. Given your background in intelligence and security, where are we at with this?
Okay, it is a problem. It's not just a British problem, it's a global issue arising out of the extraordinary advances in technology. A lot of the publicity about cyber crime or cyber attacks has been about state-to-state attacks, whether the Russians have been interfering with American elections, whether the Chinese have been trying to find out what's happening in various countries. And that does exist, and it's a huge problem. But there's two other dimensions to it as well. There are also what are often called the cyber criminals, people whose objective is not political, but is making money, is carrying out criminal acts and using the methods of cyber attack in order to advance that interest. And sometimes they work for some of the rogue governments as well, because they are used for that purpose. And the third dimension is individual hackers, individuals in their own house with sort of great enthusiasm of demonstrating how powerful they are and interfering with other people's business in a way that is unacceptable. So it's a big, big challenge to every government around the world. And some governments have come to that judgment very quickly, or have already done a lot of work on trying to prevent cyber attacks, or also on the question of resilience, how you cope in terms of your infrastructure if it has been subject to attack, how quickly you can get it back to normal. These are the issues that all countries are having to address.
But when you were involved with the Security Committee, Huawei and BT, you were very concerned about a Chinese company, state company, being involved with BT. I mean, is this a problem?
That was a particular issue because we have no particular problem, either as an Intelligence Security Committee or the public as a whole, with Chinese investment or investment by other countries in the United Kingdom. We're an open economy, we welcome investment. That is no problem. The particular controversy with regard to British telecommunications is that they were modernizing their infrastructure and proposing to use Huawei, and indeed were using Huawei, as part of that modernization program. The concern was that as all companies, all industries in China ultimately are answerable to the Chinese Communist Party, the government of China, and as the government of China allows cyber attacks and other interference as a matter of political policy, how wise was it to have such a company involved in our infrastructure? The United States and Australia had banned Huawei and said they will not prepare to deal with them. When we looked into this, a decision had been taken some years earlier to allow British Telecom to work with Huawei. And what we have got in the United Kingdom now is a unique situation. Huawei was so anxious to demonstrate how respectable and reasonable and law-abiding they would be, that what has been established is a cell of people who are paid, their salaries are paid by the Chinese, but they're actually, the appointments are made by the United Kingdom, and these are people who constantly monitor the way in which the system, the telecommunication system is working, so that if there was any interference of a improper kind, we would immediately know about it, and that would be such bad news for Huawei that it would, in practice, damage their international credibility to a high degree.
But just actually going off-piste for a minute, there was a big debate about the Chinese investment in power stations in the UK. You say we're an open economy. Are we not so open that we've actually sold too many of our assets? I mean, certainly the French would take a different view.
Well, you're quite right, the French would take a different view. The United Kingdom position, it goes back a long way. I mean, we haven't had a debate about protectionism in the United Kingdom, of tariffs and so forth about the United Kingdom, since the 1920s. It's almost 100 years since that has been all political parties in Britain believe in free trade, want to see tariffs disappearing and non-tariff barriers going. French take a different view. Both governments of the right and of the left have had a strong element of protectionism as part of what they believe is justifiable and necessary. So each country has its own approach. So far as the controversy over nuclear power stations, I mean, that's a wider question. What I personally would have wanted to argue was that one must try and avoid dealing with these questions on a piecemeal basis. We have to make more of an effort to get a coherent strategy so that when these proposals come up, not just for China, but for Russia or other countries that have suspect political objectives, that we can address that on the basis of a known strategy which will help us reach the right decision.
Right, just going back then to the issue of intelligence, I think when I certainly understand, you indicate that foreign internet providers are not cooperating in the way they should with intelligence agencies. That was a concern. Is that still a concern?
Well, of course it is a concern, because what we have is a situation where we have the main security threat from other governments is from international terrorism. We have an international terrorist threat, mainly jihadi Islamist threat, but there are also some others as well. Now, how do international terrorists operate? They operate internationally. How do they communicate with their supporters or their members in the various countries? Through the internet. And they use it as a tool. And although some of the methods of international terrorists are very crude, very medieval, they have within their ranks some very sophisticated people who enable them to use some of the most advanced information technology. And so there is a constant battle, which will never be entirely resolved, but a constant battle between our intelligence agencies and our security forces who are trying to use their knowledge of IT to combat the terrorists, to prevent them advancing their objectives. And so far, the terrorists are losing. But although they're losing, they are still very strong, and they still have powerful means of radicalizing or trying to radicalize people in various countries. So that is the kind of issue that we're dealing with at the moment. Now, when it comes to the internet service providers, if they are United Kingdom providers, like British Telecom, for example, they have to operate within our law. But many of the biggest internet providers, Facebook, Google, people like that, are United States, and they come under US law. And they will do what the US government tell them, within the legal framework, what Congress, the laws that have been passed in the US, but they're not as enthusiastic, shall we say, about cooperating with other Western governments. Now, that has had serious consequences. So there are at the moment going on, and have been for some time, discussions at the government level. I'm not involved in that, but between the US government and the UK government, because the very close cooperation between British intelligence and American intelligence goes back 70 years. And what we want to get is a situation where if these American companies get information that is relevant to terrorism, even if they don't give them directly to us, if they give them to the American intelligence agencies, they will be passed on to us.
Without doubt.
Well, that would be the way the system would normally work, because America and Britain have a very close cooperation of mutual exchange of relevant information, because you cannot deal with the problem of international terrorism. And it's not just America and Britain. The same challenges exist with regard to the whole of Europe. And because the United Kingdom has probably, because we went through the period with the IRA, we have had more experience of dealing with terrorism. We had 30 years of the IRA carrying out terrorist acts. So our way of ensuring the proper sharing of intelligence information, the proper sharing of it, the cooperation with other intelligence agencies is more advanced, and therefore the UK gives a lot of help and support in Belgium, for example, or in other European countries that have found more recently that they are facing this terrorist threat.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we'll move on to other topics, but just to finish the discussion on intelligence, Mrs. May, the Prime Minister, indicated that part of the Brexit discussion, and we'll come to that, will focus on Britain's relationship with the EU and in the context of security. Now, how do we as a country, as the UK, cooperate very closely with the EU today, and will that change in a Brexit environment?
We cooperate with European countries in two ways. Obviously, at the moment, we are a member of the European Union, so there are certain things like the Interpol, Europol, and the European arrest warrant, where cooperation takes place within the framework of membership of the same European Union. Right. That will change, but we've already said we want that cooperation to continue, and it's likely that it will. But much of our cooperation in these areas are with countries around the world that are not members of the EU. So you don't have to be a member of the European Union to have cooperation. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult, but it can be done, as we've shown with many, many countries, whether in North America or elsewhere.
Now, your speech at the Wadham, Oxford University in May 14 talked about the role of intelligence communities in the internet age. Now, the younger generation clearly think that the state is invading their privacy to a very high degree.
Some do.
Some do, but but they're not aware necessarily of the points you made in your speech.
Well,
so how can we reassure the younger generation that the balance is about right?
Well, it's not just a question of the younger generation. I mean, there are some people at all levels, at all ages, and from all backgrounds, who are worried about the powers that are given to intelligence agencies and the extent to which you can get warrants to intercept people's emails and voicemails and matters of that kind. I think there is an onus on the government and on the intelligence agencies. The onus is on them to prove why it's necessary, not on the people who are against it to prove why it's unnecessary. So, because in a free society, we start from the basis that intelligence agencies have powers that the rest of us don't have. And therefore, in a free society, we actually have to be sure that that is not improperly used. There are a whole level of safeguards in this country which provide legitimate and serious protection. Not a single email can be read unless a warrant has been applied to the relevant Secretary of State and investigated and examined at that stage. But even once that is done, we have judicial commissioners, who are people with a legal background, who retrospectively look at how the powers were used to make sure that they were used properly. We have the Intelligence and Security Committee, which I chaired, which are senior parliamentarians who have oversight of the intelligence agencies with access to the most top-secret information that these agencies possess. Now, none of these safeguards exist in Russia or China. So when Edward Snowden...
What about America?
Well,
obviously
well
not.
They do exist in America.
Right.
America has enormous safeguards. It's not exactly the same as Britain, but they have a very powerful Senate Intelligence Committee. They have judicial oversight of many of these matters. Now, what was the great irony was when Mr. Snowden, the great so-called whistleblower, decided to reveal millions of secrets of the United States in the interests of civil liberty. What does he do? He announces this in China and then takes refuge in Russia. Two countries whose intelligence agencies' prime purpose is to protect the governments of those countries from their own population and prevent a democratic system emerging. So, I mean, that was the irony of Mr. Snowden's so-called defence of civil liberties.
Well, before we go on to the next topic, which will certainly be Scotland, given that was your first cabinet post, I introduced you as the Right Honourable. Now, most of my continental colleagues are not aware of the role of the Privy Council and what it does. What does it do?
Well, you may be called Right Honourable. It doesn't necessarily mean you're right or even honourable. It is purely an honorific designation. Basically, its historic origins, the Privy Council were what we now would call the Cabinet. They were the senior advisors to the Queen or King and were the people appointed to that. In more recent times, there remains a Privy Council. It has no real political power, but it has a role in some of what we call delegated legislation, the way in which a lot of detailed legislation is approved. And in addition to that, you're appointed to the Privy Council if either you're a member of the Cabinet or you are seen to be either as a senior judge or a senior parliamentarian, someone of that sort of background who might be able to make a useful contribution.
But you're still a member of the Privy Council?
Once you're appointed, unless you do something very, very naughty,
you stay.
You remain one person.
And apparently you stand up in all the Privy Council meetings. Is that
No.
not the case?
Well, this is a misunderstanding. When you have heard that there are about 300 Privy Councillors, right. And when you have heard there has been a meeting of the Privy Council, that actually only means 5 or 6 current ministers who are Privy Councillors who go to the palace in order to complete certain legislative proposals. Right. The rest of us are not involved in that. The only time I will be active as a Privy Councillor is when, sadly, one day when the Queen dies, the new King will have to be proclaimed as King, and that is done at a meeting of the full Privy Council. It's the only time Privy Council ever actually meets in a full body.
Good. Let's, Sir Malcolm, come on to the Scottish question. Very interesting that as Scottish Secretary, you were Scotland's man in the Cabinet,
as well
or
as the
alternatively, the Cabinet's man in Scotland.
Yes.
Well, which lot which side predominated?
Well, that was some of the difficulty I had with my relations with Margaret Thatcher as the Prime Minister at the time. She assumed I was just the cabinet's man in Scotland, and I said, yes, that's true, Prime Minister, but I'm also Scotland's man in the cabinet, by which I meant that if there were demands from Scotland for certain changes, for certain policies or proposals, I didn't automatically agree with that, but if I did agree with it, I was their champion. This is in the days before a Scottish Parliament existed, or a Scottish devolved government, so the Secretary of State had that particular role.
Now, I suppose one of the key questions my continental colleagues asked me, and last week I was in Munich for the week, and I had the question 20 times, what's Scotland going to do in the context of the European Union? I mean, could Scotland effectively go it alone, either in the context of independence or in the context of the European Union?
Well, in theory, all these options are possible, but if you ask me, is that likely, I think it's incredibly improbable and unlikely. Because apart from anything else, you know, the argument that the Scottish nationalists used is if Britain is going to leave the European Union, then in order for Scotland to have access to the internal market, now is the time for it to become an independent state, a member of the EU in its own right, and thereby it would have access to the European internal market. But of course, the consequence would also be that it would cease to have access to the United Kingdom internal market, namely England and Wales. And Scotland exports 2 to 3 times as much of its exports, of its product industry and services to England and Wales than it does to continental Europe. That's not a great surprise. So we have had a single market within Britain since the Act of Union in 1707. It would be pretty dumb to actually destroy that for a market that is less important as far as Scotland's economy is concerned.
But I mean, legally, could they have a separate negotiation with the EU?
No, not as part of the United Kingdom. Not as long as they're part of the United Kingdom. You cannot have any part of a member state of the EU having a different relationship with the European Union than the country of which it is part. And the EU itself has made that clear. I mean, I don't think the Scottish nationalists ever believed that was possible. It was a presentational argument to make them seem more reasonable and willing to compromise than was in fact the case. It was never on the cards.
Now, just going back, one of the issues you would handle as Scottish Secretary was the issue of ferries, Caledonia, McBrain and Northling. Do the Scottish population realise the cost of the ferries to the taxpayer, 150 million? Did you as Secretary of State have to challenge the whole issue of how the ferries are run?
I doubt if most people realise what the precise cost was or the precise detail as to where the system operates, but there is a wide recognition throughout Scotland and indeed throughout the United Kingdom that the nature of our country is that there are a large number of small, relatively isolated island communities, and most of them happen to be off the northwest coast of Scotland. And it goes back a very, very long time that these small islands, which are some of the most attractive and tourist visited parts of the country, but you need access, and for most people that means access by boat, and therefore because of the very small populations involved, it cannot, in some cases it can be commercial, but in most cases it can't be done on a purely commercial basis.
Partly it was in your time that road equivalent tariff was actually raised for the first time.
Well, the issue was looked at and people raised it as a possibility, but if I remember correctly, and I haven't thought about it for a long time, I think it was found to be, you couldn't simply have an arbitrary formula based on road equivalent tariff that would...
But we've got it now. We've got it now.
Well, I've not had the opportunity to study how that might be working.
Well, we have it now, so but maybe you started it.
Well, certainly the debate began in my time, but I think it's only been more recently that people have been persuaded to go that way. And
quite interestingly, in terms of the scale of the Scottish economy, I mean, I think Scotland has about 8% of GDP, 8% of the population. So really, it's not a viable option, quite apart from your reference to the market.
What, you mean independence?
Yes, from an economic point of view.
I am totally against an independent Scotland. I think there are lots of reasons of which economica is part of the equation. So I don't have to be persuaded that it's a pretty dumb idea, in my view. But that's not the same as saying it couldn't happen. The world has 180 states. You can call yourself an independent state. The question is not whether you could be nominally independent. The question is whether you would benefit or suffer as a consequence, whether it makes sense. And you have to go back and just remind ourselves why the union of Scotland and England happened in the first place. From Scotland's point of view, the union was attractive because it gave us access to the whole of England's markets, a far bigger country, far bigger population, far bigger economic opportunities, and that remains the case. And now that the oil of the North Sea is largely depleted, I mean, the price of oil has collapsed anyway, but even the oil that remains is 75% depleted. The Scottish economy would certainly suffer serious downside problems if we broke away from the rest of the UK. It just doesn't add up in any sensible way.
Commercial sense. Well, let's go on to transport. I think you were surprised to become Transport Secretary from what I gather. But I understand within 3 days you were the British minister in the Channel Tunnel welcoming the French, or the French were welcoming you. Is that right?
This is the way I choose to present it. That for
Did the French present it a different way?
Well, I don't know. But no. For several hundreds of years, people had talked about a Channel Tunnel. And no sooner did I become Transport Secretary, 3 days later, I was under the English Channel meeting my French counterpart, because the people digging from either side, at that stage, just digging the hole that the Eurostar would eventually be used to fill, that's when we had the breakthrough. And I wasn't the first person to shake hands for 10,000 years. That honour was given to a workman on either side who'd been doing the actual digging. So a British guy and a French guy did that. And then the two ministers, myself and my French counterpart, did that. But even then, vive la différence between Britain and France, because, for example, the French, we had a celebration. The French were drinking champagne, and I think we had sparkling water. There were signs on the British side, strictly no smoking, because we're underground. The French were smoking their 10 bleus and their gaulois. So vive la différence.
Well, but do you think actually the tunnel, which is the direct link, of course, between the continent and the UK, has changed anything in the political climate? The fact we've got a physical link?
Yeah, curiously enough, not in the political climate. We're still an island, whether it was a tunnel or a bridge. You don't cease to be an individual country with a distinct culture because of that island status. And so I don't think it's had a political impact. I think it's had a cultural impact. And it obviously, I'm just a few days from now, I shall be going by Eurostar to Brussels. And it's the only way I would travel nowadays to Paris or Brussels. I would never dream of going by plane. It's much more comfortable and sensible. So it's a huge achievement. I think it's particularly important for freight. It seemed to me that I've always believed that if you're able to maximize the freight opportunities, then we can now contemplate a situation of getting massive amounts of freight, either from British factories right through to markets in Italy or Spain or France or Germany, or vice versa, in a way that would not have been possible. And that takes a huge potential burden off our roads. I think, I've always believed this, that there is a massive public interest in getting less freight carried on the roads and more on rail. And that was never really possible in terms of international trade until the Channel Tunnel was built. Now, I know there are big problems, but most of these problems ought to be solvable, at least over a period of time.
Now, interestingly, we're coming to a general election in the United Kingdom in June 8. The Labour Party is talking about nationalising the railways. I understand as Transport Secretary, you were very much in favour of the privatisation process. In fact, were the minister responsible for its process?
Only for the early stage, but I had disagreements, and that might explain why I was only Transport Minister for a relatively short period, because although I did strongly support and do support the privatisation of the railways, I think it's been a huge plus, and we've seen a massive growth in passenger use of railways in Britain over these years. But I thought then, and I still think, it was unwise to separate the control of the trains using the track from the control of the infrastructure. Railtrack, the creation of Railtrack as a separate body owning and controlling ultimately all the infrastructure. And what persuaded me, I didn't have that view before I came to the Department of Transport. I hadn't really thought about it. But the more I thought about it as Transport Secretary, the more I took the view that, as if I'm not mistaken, something like 40% of costs for an operator relate to the infrastructure. It's not very, it's counterintuitive, it's not very sensible that the operator in effect has little control over 40% of his costs, because that is the infrastructure which is owned and operated by somebody else. So I've never been persuaded that that was a wise way forward.
Well, Britain's model is, of course, quite different. I mean, in Germany, with DB, they are both infrastructure and operator.
Yeah, well, that's the
but that
structure.
you preferred that.
I've preferred it then, but the Treasury didn't, because they thought that would make competition much less likely if one operator also controlled the infrastructure. My point was that the competition for the vast majority of these lines didn't come from two operators wanting to offer rail services on the same line. The real competition came from road and air, whether people would travel by air or by road as opposed to train. That's where the real, there are one or two exceptions to that, but for the most of the rail infrastructure, there isn't any serious prospect of competitors. You can have people competing for the initial tender, but not simultaneously operating on the lines.
Well, I mean, that's a big debate. We could spend a whole discussion on that. As a matter of interest, one of my colleagues in the Freight Leaders Forum and I sit on the management board of the European Railway Agency in Valenciennes. We are there as so-called freight experts. Do you see with Brexit Britain withdrawing from that, given the commitment of the European Agency for Railways is standard signals, standard systems of operation and safety standards throughout Europe? Do you see us coming out of that?
I'm not an expert in this area, but I think this is just one of the issues where there still will have to be cooperation and collaboration and hopefully common standards. The way you regulate that, the way you administer that may have to change to reflect the fact that we're no longer a member of the European Union. But it will depend ultimately if both the British side and the continental European side both want to maintain easiest rail access, then all the progress that has been made in that sphere over the last few years, both sides will want to perpetuate, even though it may require a different form in order to.
Well, I think one of our concerns is, will the government listen to us who are involved in it? And I think that's the concern, because...
But do you mean listen or do you mean agree?
Well, I think it's our job. I think, as you said, Sir Malcolm, that it's the job of government in intelligence to produce a cogent argument to support their point of view.
Yes.
Our obligation would to provide that cogent argument.
Yes, the obligation you will have is to persuade the government, which you may very well be able to do, that it's not just in your interest, but it's in the wider public interest. That is the crucial question, because very often when you have parts of industry or parts of business talking to government, they use the language of the public interest, but actually it's the interest of their own particular sector that they're preoccupied with. And sometimes that is the same as the public interest, but not always.
I think one of the disappointments for us with the Trans-European Networks, 10T, this became a big issue, I think, after you were Transport Secretary. But it's been one of, we think, the best successes in Europe. There's 9 vertical corridors where the majority of people and freight will move over the next 20, 30 years. And the concept is to remove barriers or bottlenecks.
Well, that must be right.
The question is, if a lot of projects have been financed under 10T within the UK, it'll be interesting to see if the UK has to give the money back for the projects that have been undertaken.
Well, I'd be surprised if money has to be given back. If the money's been spent and it's been spent properly, then regardless of who was spending it, then that seems, as long as it was properly done at the time, I don't think there'll be any retrospective change. But I think the more complex question is how you provide for cooperation in the future.
Well, turning to defence, which, I mean, you enjoyed your time, as we can see, at the Ministry of Defence. I think one of the issues is that Britain is spending 2% of its GDP on defence. A lot of our continental friends are not. How do we explain to our continental colleagues Britain's role in the defence of Europe? We have got the Triton submarines. We have got the third biggest defence budget in the world. How do our continental colleagues relate to that? Do they actually, to some degree, rely on the United Kingdom for the defence?
Well, let's be clear, what we're discussing at the moment on defence is not EU business. The European Union does not directly deal with defence policy. It deals with other forms of security, and that's very important. But defence is essentially a NATO responsibility, our membership of NATO, that deals with these issues. And you are correct in saying that the United Kingdom, not just the United Kingdom, but the United Kingdom and a relatively small number of other European countries do comply with the agreement that defence expenditure should be at least 2% of GDP. There's a lot of pressure from the United States at the moment on other countries to come up to that level, and they are beginning to move in that direction. But the level that we spend on our defence in the United Kingdom reflects our own historic responsibilities. And of course, we are not just a European country, we also have strong maritime interests. Traditionally, our Royal Navy has been perhaps the most important of the three services in historic terms in the United Kingdom. And it's interesting that at the moment in our defence expenditure, you mentioned the Trident submarines, which are the fundamental part of our nuclear structure, defence structure, but there are also the two new aircraft carriers being built, which will be state-of-the-art aircraft carriers and enable the UK to deploy its military capability globally whenever that is thought to be necessary. So I think in terms of Europe's overall defence and security, whether we're in the EU or outside the EU, the United Kingdom is a crucial player. We're in the permanent member of the Security Council. We're along with France, one of the two European countries that have nuclear weapons capabilities, and also along with France, we are the two countries with the most serious military conventional capability. So I think that is already recognized as likely to be a very important area of future cooperation.
But it's interesting, the Europeans were quite keen to develop a European defence force, whereas
they were quite keen to use that rhetoric.
And do you think it was rhetoric on?
Well, not entirely rhetoric, but I think, France and Germany, who are the two most important countries in this respect, have both made it abundantly clear they are not remotely interested in a European army, and quite literally a single army, because if you have a European army, you must then have a European government to determine whether to use that army. You can't have that dealt with by 27 countries. So the idea is completely out of the equation. Where the issue has been controversial recently, the serious proposal that had emerged from within the European Union was whether the European Union should facilitate a command and control arrangement to cover operations which were not NATO operations, but where European countries by themselves were wanting to carry out a particular task. Britain and Poland and the Baltic states and some others were rather concerned about that because we thought that would weaken NATO and the benefits would be outweighed by the disadvantages. Others took a different view. Now that the United Kingdom will be leaving the European Union, it's for the other countries to make up their mind whether they still wish to go in that direction.
But presumably, well, we would hope that NATO will still be the primary
it's crucial.
organisation.
Of course, there was a debate in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War whether we still needed NATO. Thanks to Mr. Putin's policies in Crimea and Ukraine and destabilizing the Baltic states, or trying to, that is no longer an issue. All NATO countries now agree that not only is NATO needed, but it's needed to a greater degree than has been required at any time since 1989.
Well, what did you do to Mr. Putin? In what way did you upset him such that he's banned you from Russia?
Me personally, you mean?
Yes,
well,
apparently.
I can give you an answer. I'm not the only one. No, this is when, as a consequence of the illegal annexation of Crimea, which was the worst example since 1938 of one European state annexing the territory of another without proper diplomatic and serious negotiations involved, but just by an act of military capability, and also destabilized eastern Ukraine, which continues to be a major flashpoint. There was no question of NATO going to war with Russia, but the decision was taken to impose economic sanctions. And there were a number of us who argued that these sanctions couldn't just be symbolic, they had to be financial and banking sanctions of a kind that were helpful in getting Iran to the nuclear negotiating table, and so forth. So these have been implemented, and the Russians were rather annoyed about that. And about 60 or 70 European senior political figures, including myself,
were banned.
We were never directly informed of that, right. But the Russians let it be known.
You would not be welcome.
Handed somebody in Brussels a list of names, of which I was, well, all I can say is if there had to be such a list, I was very proud to be on it.
But some people say, and in fact I was speaking to the former foreign minister of Estonia, And he was telling me the biggest problem, really from NATO's point of view, albeit in hindsight, was they did not intervene in Georgia early enough, which set the scene for the other events that occurred.
I know what he means, and in one sense, of course, he can argue that point of view. But although I'm a very strong supporter of Ukraine and of Estonia and of Georgia, they could never have been given membership of NATO. Because the whole point about NATO is it's not a political alliance, it's a defense alliance. Under Article 5, we are committed, if necessary, to go to war to protect the territories of countries who are members. And there was never the serious possibility that the United States or France or Britain or Germany would go to war with Russia, with all that that implies, because of the differences of view or Georgia, or because of their sanctions, yes, diplomatic isolation, punishment of various other kinds, certainly. But you can't start a third world war because of that. And therefore, that had to constrain the extent to which NATO responded. The worst thing is to make threats you're not prepared to carry out.
Yes, Frederick the Great had an opinion about that, did he not?
Well, it was I think the Frederick the Great remark, which is one I've often used, is in a slightly different context. Frederick the Great said, diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. If you want to achieve a diplomatic resolution without conflict, then if the people you're negotiating with know that you do have a military option, if all else fails, that concentrates the mind wonderfully.
Actually, it brings clearly the issue to the fore. I mean, I actually have the privilege of having a residence overlooking the Faslane submarine base,
and
I enjoy the view of the nuclear submarines and conventional. But you have no hesitation in saying that Britain must renew the Trident submarine.
Oh, I have no hesitation. We have this capability, and to not renew them would be an act of unilateral disarmament. Now, that's not the same as saying that we should not be, all of us, trying a heck of a lot harder to get multilateral disarmament. I am a member of Global Zero and various other organizations that try to, because there are far too many nuclear weapons in the world. Most of them are either American or Russian. We've had quite a lot of progress. People sometimes forget this. At the end of the Cold War, there were about 60,000 nuclear warheads in the world. 60,000 nuclear warheads, all of which were more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. 60,000. Today there are 15,000.
Really?
Yes. Yes, because many of these were what are called tactical nuclear weapons or nuclear depth charges. They were not all had the same destructive capability as the kind of nuclear weapons that people sometimes talk about. But there are still 15,000. And 80% of these, 90% of these are either American or Russian.
Really?
They each have about 6, 12, 6 to 7.
Do you worry about Pakistan? I mean, I was speaking to an Indian the other day in Munich, and he obviously would have a different view of Pakistan, but his concern with Pakistan was things have not improved, it's really in many ways unstable, yet they have nuclear capability.
Sure, but
is this very serious?
Well, of course, all these things are very, very serious. But again, you have to get this in proper perspective. During the Cold War, the ultimate risk was of a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, or between NATO and the Soviet Union. That would have destroyed the planet. There would have been no winners to that. When you're dealing with Pakistan and India, who have huge political differences, which is why Pakistan has developed nuclear weapons, or North Korea, or one or two other areas, the devastation, and it would be ghastly devastation, but it would be regional. It would be to a particular part of the world, to Pakistan and India, to the Korean Peninsula, to parts of the Middle East or whatever. These countries do not have the capability for a global nuclear holocaust. So, not that I take much comfort in that. I mean, the destructive capability is still very substantial. So I think what is needed is a much greater priority for multilateral nuclear disarmament. It may not be realistic to believe you can get down to zero, at least not in our lifetime. But the United States and Russia, for example, could meet their total defense requirements, even if they came down from, at the moment they have something like 6,000 nuclear warheads, let us say to 1,000 each. And by doing that, that would set an example to other countries, which would also have a benefit in showing that there was a process of trying to reduce the risks that nuclear weapons represent.
We could ask you lots of questions on that. Just one before we leave and go on to foreign affairs. Why did we give Harrier jump jets to the Americans at low cost? And have we not suffered as a consequence with the lack of aircraft for the new carriers?
Well, no, I think that the decision on the Harrier.
I don't think it was you, was it?
No, it certainly wasn't. No, it was a good number of years later. Decisions are taken at the time. Do you have a requirement for a particular asset? If you don't have that requirement, they're still very valuable assets. And if a good friend and ally wants to acquire them, then you go ahead.
Now going on to foreign affairs, I think as Foreign Secretary, of course, you had major responsibilities. And we have, as well, you know, the ambassadors in all countries. In what circumstance would a Foreign Secretary recall an ambassador, given the crisis or the debates or concerns in countries like Iran, Turkey today, which is definitely on a different direction, North Korea? Is there a case ever to withdraw an ambassador from a country where we are in serious conflict?
Well, normally when you are in serious disagreement, there's even more reason to have ambassadors to maintain the contact, to maintain the dialogue. So as a general principle, you do not withdraw ambassadors even if you have total disagreements, because that's counterproductive. Occasionally, something happens which is so objectionable that you have to make a short-term symbolic statement, and the dismissal of an ambassador or the withdrawal of your own ambassadors is a way of doing that. I remember when I was, for example, in government, the Nigerian military government were found to have been responsible for...
General Ojukwu, was that right?
Well, I can't remember the exact... No, I don't think at this particular time...
He was Biafra, sorry.
There were several military governments, but this was a opposition politician, Mr. Diko, who was living in the United Kingdom, and he was kidnapped on behalf of the Nigerian government in Britain, and they tried to smuggle him out of Britain. And when we discovered what was going on, we expelled the Nigerian High Commissioner as a statement of our displeasure. There was a new one appointed, but that was a way of demonstrating. So occasionally these things are necessary or desirable.
What do you feel about the whole debate with Iran? They're going to elect a new president in the next few days, I suppose. Are you concerned about the way it's going? Is Trump right to challenge the agreement on nuclear weapons?
There's two dimensions to this. The nuclear agreement that was reached with Iran is being maintained, and even Trump is, for the time being at least, giving up any idea of trying to dismantle that. And the Iranians are, or appear to be, fulfilling their side of the bargain. But the concern with Iran is not just on the nuclear weapons front. They do give support to terrorist organizations. They do give assistance to, for example, Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization based in Lebanon, which is seeking to destabilize the region. And they are seen by many of the other countries in the region, particularly the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, as a destabilizing force. So against that background, President Rouhani is a relative moderate figure.
Educated at Glasgow University,
well,
apparently.
there you are, you see it, and that is a strong point in his favor. But Iran's a complex country. It is a theocratic dictatorship, but under the supreme leader, who's the person with real power. It's not the president who has the ultimate power, but they do have some real elections, and we do not know who's going to win this presidential election. Rouhani himself was not the person whom the regime had wanted when he was elected by the public. So Iran is not just a sort of typical dictatorship with no free choice for the people. There are varying degrees of genuine public debate and public choice available.
I know you've visited Iran as a student.
As a student, yes, not as a minister.
No, you didn't go as minister,
no.
No, I came out 3 weeks before the Shah. I was there for 2 years, so it was quite a different experience.
It must have been.
And yes, indeed. Now, just going on to just another small point, I suppose one of the issues, still currently, and Gibraltar's now in the news with Brexit, the Falklands. Have we sufficient ships to defend the Falklands?
Oh, the situation militarily is quite different to what it was back in 1982 for two reasons. First of all, the Argentinian military is a shadow of what it was then. It was a military junta who were in power. And since then, there has been no modernization of their capability, and they have a far smaller military capability than they had. So there's no serious risk at that end. The other big change is we now have a proper runway in Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands. So if there was any sign of increasing tension, we could reinforce our military presence in the Falkland Islands very, very quickly. The problem in 1982 was that there was no such runway, and it would take weeks to reinforce the islands by naval means. So in all sorts of ways, the threat to the islands, which at the moment is pretty low-key anyway, because we have a democratic government in Argentina, which does not have the slightest intention, so as one can tell, of military confrontation.
But you were involved in negotiations with the Argentinians, I believe.
When I was Foreign Secretary, that was a separate matter. That was an approach we received from the then Foreign Minister of Argentina, who wanted to put some new ideas and proposals, and we had some private discussions on that.
Going on to, I suppose, well, we'll just briefly touch in the United States. You talk about the Atlantic as being a bridge rather than a gulf. Do you still think that? And are you confident or not confident about trade deals? Mr. Trump's clearly challenged some of the trade deals that have been put in place.
Well, if you're discreetly asking whether I'm a great admirer of President Trump, the answer is no, I'm not. I think it's a deeply disturbing fact that we have a President of the United States who has the temperament and the volatility and the inexperience that he represents. And any president who spends part of his time tweeting as a way of communicating with the outside world, I think is incredibly dangerous and foolish. So I start as somebody who's deeply nervous about what we are experiencing, but I have to acknowledge, as everyone else does, that he is the elected President of the United States. And therefore, during the time he is President, we have to do our best to work with him. And fortunately, he seems to think the United Kingdom is a country he has more time for than some others, for whatever reason, perhaps because his mother was Scottish, who knows. And therefore, there are many areas of cooperation that continue, and that's very healthy.
You obviously have a good relationship with Madeleine Albright. I think
Madeleine Albright and I were colleagues when I was Secretary of State, and we've remained friends ever since.
And you meet at the Aspen...
Well, there's a group of former foreign ministers who meet regularly under her benign chairmanship, which is very agreeable.
So you're still keeping contact with your former colleagues. I mean, that's how it's done.
Well, it doesn't have to be done that way. It depends on the individual's own preferences. But I went into politics primarily because of an interest in foreign policy. So even when you're not a foreign minister, you continue to have that interest.
I suppose one of the questions now, the world population is 7.2 billion, going 9.5 by 2050. If we look at the institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations itself, the World Health Organization in Geneva, are they all fit for purpose? Have we got the right global agencies for the governance of 7.2 or 7.3 billion people?
It is right to have these global organizations. Most of them were created in the aftermath of the Second World War, and therefore it's not surprising that in some cases they need modernizing and changing, and the governance of these organizations needs to reflect the political realities that we live with today. And some of that is proving very difficult to achieve change, but ultimately it will happen. I mean, for example, we talk about the G8, but when there was the financial crisis in 2009, 2010, we had to more or less spontaneously create the G20 to ensure that many of the new emerging
So that's why it
economies-
was created?
Well, it wasn't something that had been long planned. Suddenly there was a need to have close cooperation with countries like Brazil, with India, with Indonesia, countries that clearly were major players but had not been so advanced as economies as to be part of the G8 top structure. And so the G20 was more or less invented overnight as a means of doing that. No, this was the Labour government.
Labour government. And of course, one of your crowning glories must be Poland. And your involvement in Poland at the time of...
Well, I was not even in the cabinet at that stage. I was a Minister of State at the Foreign Office, but I happened to be on a visit to Poland at a time when Solidarity had been banned. And I had discussed in advance of my visit, the visit with representatives of Solidarity, which was the resistance movement, the trade union resistance movement under Lech Wałęsa. And I had a meeting in the British ambassador's residence with the leaders of Solidarity, who, in the British government at the time, the communist government, were very upset because they had banned Solidarity. They took exception to having this meeting, but it created a precedent where future visitors from the West also insisted on such contact. And within a few months, the Polish Communist government had to reverse their banning of Solidarity and accept that it was a legitimate organization. So that has obviously been something I was pleased to have been involved with.
Well, thank you very much for that. A couple of comments on Brexit, perhaps, before we conclude our discussions. The Human Rights Act, 1998, is central to many discussions in this country. Perhaps one of the reasons people voted for Brexit was to do with A, human rights, and B, migration.
The Human Rights Act, of course, has nothing to do with the European Union.
Well, I think I know that, but I
well,
don't think most people do.
Well, that's right, because, of course, as obviously you are aware, the European Convention on Human Rights was something signed after the Second World War, and that is something which we are signatories of. That is quite distinct from the European Court of Justice, which exists to administer European Union law and has jurisdiction over directives, regulations and other legislation of the European Union operating in each country.
But is it true if a country wants to join the EU, they have to be a signatory to the European human rights?
Well, it's wide, they do, but it's even wider than that, because we also have an organization called the Council of Europe, which has existed for many years. And when, after the end of the Cold War, countries like Russia and other Eastern European countries, which had been communist dictatorships, wanted to join, they were only permitted to do so if they undertook to accept the jurisdiction of the European Convention of Human Rights. And Russia, for example, remains a signatory. And it means, therefore, if you think your rights have been breached by the actions of the Russian government, you have the legal right to go to the European Court. And there have been cases against Russia held in that court.
So you see a sting in the Council of
there
Europe?
have been
I hope Britain's not going to surely come out of that.
Well, there have been people who have argued that we should come out of it for reasons that I personally don't agree with. I was very pleased to see the Prime Minister, Theresa May, saying that would not be part of the Conservative manifesto. We would not be proposing that over the next 5 years, and I think that was the right decision.
Very good. Well, I think there are so many questions, and I suppose some people might say that the European Union were going too far too fast and didn't give Prime Minister Cameron enough of a deal to put to the British people. I mean, is that a view you would accept, or was
well,
that a view
obviously,
you would reject?
I voted Remain, and I'm disappointed at the result that happened, but I don't think it's disastrous. I mean, I think the reality is the United Kingdom has been a semi-detached member of the European Union ever since we joined, and therefore it was an accident waiting to happen. Obviously, if there'd been more proposals, concessions made in the discussions with David Cameron at the time, it is possible the outcome might have been different, but that's one of the great unknowns. We will never know.
Well, I think it's very important. There's so many countries coming to Glasgow this week, very important, and most of them are from the continent. What advice do you give them in terms of how they should look at the United Kingdom, A, in terms of the negotiation, and B, in terms of will we still continue to trade?
Okay.
How will our relationships change? I think that's very fundamental.
Right, let me comment on that if I may. I think the first crucial point is to recognise that what happened in the United Kingdom over Brexit was not similar to what is called Trumpism in the United States. When Trump was was campaigning, he was asking for a mandate to do some pretty extreme things across a whole spectrum of areas, quite different to anything the United States had been doing under any president for very many years. And that still remains part of his aspirations, even if he's having difficulty implementing that. In France, you've had the Le Pen dimension of the National Front and so forth. The United Kingdom was quite different. We have had no extreme right-wing party. UKIP was not an extreme right-wing party in the sense of the National Front in France. It had a single issue, which was our membership of the EU, and the whole debate of about the European Union, our membership of it, was whether we wanted to become as independent as America or Canada or other Western countries, or accept the supranationalism inherent in the European Union. Now, for various reasons, the United Kingdom's majority decision in Britain was that we should leave the European Union. That was not an example of isolationism or a desire to be unfriendly with continental European countries. And Theresa May has herself said as Prime Minister, what she wants in these negotiations at the end of it is to have a deep and substantive and amicable relationship between Britain and its European neighbours. We are part of Europe. We may not be part of the European Union, but our whole history has shown over 200 years that whenever democracy or stability is threatened in Europe by some potential aggressor, we have been one of those who has responded in order to protect freedom. We did it when Napoleon was trying to dominate Europe. Britain was with other European countries ensuring that did not happen. In 1914, when Belgium was invaded, 1939, when Poland was invaded by Hitler, we were not part of a European Union, we were not in continental Europe, but we went to war along with other countries because Europe's liberty was at threat. That hasn't changed because we're now leaving the European Union. So if there are future threats to Europe, its stability, its freedom, its democracy, its open government, we will be on the side of all those fighting to preserve that. And you don't, as our history has shown, although it might be nice to be part of the European Union, you don't have to be a member of the European Union for that to be ensured. And the challenge now is for ourselves, for France, for Germany, for Italy, for Spain, for the other countries, to recognize that Europe's diversity is unavoidable and that sometimes you have to think of new relationships in order to ensure that the aspirations of the various countries can all be realized.
Well, that's excellent. And I think just one final comment. I mean, this wonderful book, Power and Pragmatism, it's a very, very good book indeed. I was fascinated by your comment on pragmatic politicians and conviction politicians. Yeah. And I suppose one conclusion might be that people like Romano Prodi, people like Junkers would be conviction politicians, where maybe Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Tusk were pragmatic politicians.
Well, the point I'm making is I don't say these are absolutes, that you're one or the other, and there the twain shall meet. What I say is that conviction politicians are people who have very deep beliefs, which they are absolutely certain are the right way forward, but occasionally they can be actually very pragmatic when it suits them. I worked for Margaret Thatcher. She could be very pragmatic when it was necessary. The reverse also applies. If you're pragmatic, you begin by saying, what is the common sense solution to this problem? But that doesn't mean you don't have convictions. You have ethical, moral convictions, you have deep values, but you don't want to say every problem has to be solved according to some ideological conviction that you start off with. That can lead you down a blind alley. So it's a difference of emphasis rather than a fundamental difference. And yes, I think you're right. I think Theresa May and Angela Merkel are on the side of the pragmatists. I think somebody like Mr. Juncker is perhaps more on the other end of that spectrum.
So Malcolm Rifkind, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.